Welcome back to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. Before we dive in, if you have any stories or events that you'd like to share, please feel free to leave a comment or hit us up on our Instagram. If you're concerned that your stories are too short, don't be. They're worth hearing. The stories like yours help keep the channel going. We notice a large portion of you are watching our videos and aren't subscribed. Let's go ahead and change that. I run with a paranormal team called Dead Watch. We have some strange encounters, but nothing like what happened in the Auglaize Village. This isolated village, deep in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, felt like it had been forgotten by time, and it turned out to be the site of one of the most unsettling experiences we've ever had. We arrived late in the afternoon, the village shrouded in an eerie stillness. My brother, Austin, who's usually the brave one, immediately started feeling unwell. He looked pale and mentioned a pounding headache. We began our investigation at an old doctor's office, and at a moment of provocation, Austin began to anger something. He got sicker and decided to sleep in the car without telling anyone. In our excitement and nerves, we didn't notice he was gone and assumed he was still with us. The village was unnervingly quiet. As we moved through the deserted streets, we talked to keep our nerves in check. The moon occasionally broke through the thick clouds, casting a ghostly glow over the abandoned buildings. Suddenly, I noticed someone was walking beside us. It looked like Austin. He was moving with his usual casual stride, and in the dim light, I could have sworn it was him. "Austin?" I called out, confused. He didn't respond, just kept walking towards a field where an old, decrepit house stood, with another structure behind it, maybe an old barn. I shouted again, louder this time, "Austin!" But he kept going, ignoring me completely. We decided to follow him, curiosity and concern driving us forward. As we got closer, I watched in disbelief as Austin reached the porch and turned to face us. His expression was blank, devoid of any recognition or emotion. The air around us grew colder, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. And then, in an instant, Austin and the entire house vanished. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. It was as if they had been wiped off the face of the earth. We stood there frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Panic set in and we sprinted back to the car. My heart was pounding as I yanked open the door. There was Austin, lying in the back seat, fast asleep. I shook him awake, frantically asking if he'd been to the house or seen anything strange. He looked at me with sleepy, confused eyes. What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time," he mumbled. His confusion seemed genuine, setting a chill down my spine. Adding to the terror, we had heard whispers in the woods that sounded eerily like our own voices. Something was mimicking us. Over time, the entire investigation became a blur. Everything started getting fuzzy, and we all began feeling the same sense of sickness and disorientation. There are blank spots in our memories, entire segments of the night that none of us can recall. We packed up our gear and left Auglaize Village as quickly as we could, the drive home filled with a heavy silence. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, replaying the night's events over and over, trying to find some semblance of reason. To this day, none of us have gone back to Auglaize Village. That night changed everything for us. It made us question everything we thought we knew about the paranormal. Austin still insists he doesn't remember anything unusual, but the rest of us can't forget what we saw. Whenever we talk about it, there's a palpable tension in the room. It's a story we share with a mix of fear and fascination, knowing that some things are beyond explanation. It's the reason we continue our investigations, always searching for answers, even when they seem impossible to find. We later discovered that the whole site of the village was on top of Native American land, and one possible explanation that keeps coming up is skinwalkers. It's a theory that fits with what we experienced, but it doesn't make it any less terrifying. That night in Auglaize Village is a constant reminder of the unknown, a testament to the mysteries that still lurk in the shadows. It's a part of our journey with Dead Watch, and it's something that will stay with us forever. I'll never forget that summer evening, no matter how many years pass or how much I try to rationalize it. My sister, Lily, and I were in the backyard, giving our 2 dogs, Max and Bella, a bath. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over everything. The smell of wet dog fur, mixed with the fragrance of freshly cut grass, hung in the air, and we laughed as the dogs shook water all over us. Out of nowhere, Max bolted towards the sliding glass door leading to the kitchen, barking furiously. Bella quickly followed, her barks joining his in a cacophony of alarm. It wasn't unusual for the dogs to get excited, but this time it was different. There was an urgency in their barks that was hard to ignore. "Lily, what's up with them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged, looking as puzzled as I felt. Maybe they saw a squirrel or something. Curiosity got the better of us, and we turned to look at the sliding glass door. At first, all we saw was our own reflection in the glass. But then, movement caught my eye. Someone, or something, was walking away from the door, disappearing into the shadows of the house. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Lily nodded, her face pale. "Who is that? We're supposed to be alone." Max and Bella's barking grew more frantic, their claws scratching at the glass. We exchanged a look of mutual dread. The figure was inside our house, where we had been only moments before. The thought of an intruder being so close without us realizing it left us uneasy. "I'll call Mr. Jenkins," I said, referring to our elderly neighbor who lived next door. He was retired and always at home, often keeping an eye on the neighborhood. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers trembling. "Mr. Jenkins, it's Jake. Can you please check our house? We think someone might be inside." I blurted out as soon as he answered. His voice was calm, reassuring. "Stay where you are, kids. I'll be right over." While we waited, Lily and I stood in the yard, not daring to move any closer to the house. Max and Bella had quieted down, but remained tense, staring intently at the door. Their unease mirrored our own. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Jenkins arrived. He was carrying a flashlight and an old baseball bat. "Stay here," he instructed firmly before entering our home through the back door. We watched as the beam of his flashlight danced around the interior. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, he emerged, shaking his head. "There's no one in there," he said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I checked every room, every closet. Are you sure you saw someone?" Lily and I exchanged uneasy glances. We had both seen it, hadn't we? That shadowy figure moving away from the door was no figment of our imagination. The dogs had reacted to something very real. "Yes, we saw someone," I insisted, my voice barely a whisper. "But if there's no one in there?" Mr. Jenkins sighed, patting my shoulder. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light. The setting sun can cast strange shadows." His explanation made sense, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at my gut. We decided to stay outside, waiting for our parents to come home. The minutes dragged by, each one filled with tension. Max and Bella stayed close, their eyes still fixed on the house. When our parents finally pulled into the driveway, we rushed to them, relief washing over us. We told them what happened, and they listened with growing concern. Dad went inside to double-check everything, and Mom stayed with us, her arms wrapped protectively around our shoulders. "There's no sign of forced entry," Dad said when he came back out. "Everything's locked up tight. Maybe it was just your imagination." But I knew it wasn't. The dogs had seen it too, and animals didn't have imaginations. Something, or someone, had been in our house that evening. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, every creak and groan of the house amplified by our anxiety. Eventually, exhaustion overcame us, and we drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the days that followed, nothing else unusual happened, but the memory of that night lingered like a dark cloud over us. I still can't explain what we saw, or who, or what had been in our home. But even now, years later, the thought of it makes me uneasy. Some things are better left unexplained, I suppose, but that doesn't stop me from wondering. Every time I pass by that sliding glass door, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure once more. When I was in college, my friends and I became obsessed with ghost hunting. It was the fall of our junior year, and we were drawn to the mysterious and the unknown, driven by stories of haunted places and the thrill of the unknown. One night, our curiosity took us to an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, a place that had been the subject of countless ghost stories and urban legends. There were 5 of us that night: me, Jake, Sarah, Mia, and Lucas. Armed with flashlights, a Ouija board, and a couple of digital recorders, we made our way into the crumbling building. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and our footsteps echoed ominously through the empty halls. It wasn't long before the atmosphere started getting to us. The further we ventured, the more we felt a growing sense of unease, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes. We tried to laugh it off, but the nervous energy in our voices betrayed our fear. After about an hour of wandering and a few half-hearted attempts at contacting spirits with the Ouija board, we reached the asylum's old courtyard. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the space, and it was here that we decided to take a break. As we were sitting on the remains of a stone fountain, sharing stories and trying to calm our nerves, Mia suddenly stood up, saying she needed to use the bathroom. We watched her walk towards the darkened doorway of the west wing, her flashlight beam bobbing with each step. Minutes passed and Mia didn't return. Jake, ever the brave one, suggested we go look for her. As we retraced our steps back into the building, our calls for Mia went unanswered. Just as panic started to set in, Sarah spotted something in the distance. A figure slumped on a rock near the edge of the courtyard. We ran over and found Mia unconscious. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. We shook her gently until her eyes fluttered open. The look of terror in her eyes is something I'll never forget. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "He wants us to play a game." Confused and scared, we asked her what she meant. She took a deep breath and said, "Charlie, Charlie. He wants us to play Charlie, Charlie." Despite our fear, curiosity got the better of us. We set up the crude game with 2 pencils and a piece of paper, forming a makeshift spirit board. With trembling hands, we asked, "Are we going to survive here?" The pencil slowly moved to no. That was all we needed to see. We bolted from the courtyard, running blindly through the darkened halls, desperately trying to find our way out. In the chaos, I got separated from the group. The hallways twisted and turned, each one looking the same as the last. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was alone in this haunted place. For what felt like an eternity, I wandered the asylum, every creak and distant whisper feeding my terror. Finally, after an hour, I stumbled upon my friends near the main entrance. Relief washed over me as we regrouped and made our way to the exit. We burst through the doors into the night air, our breaths ragged and our minds reeling. But as we stood there trying to collect ourselves, Sarah turned to us with a strange look in her eyes. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, exasperated. "We're literally out of that place." Sarah shook her head, her eyes distant. "I don't know. I just feel like something followed us out." We all exchanged uneasy glances, but decided it was best to get as far away from the asylum as possible. The ride back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, the terror of the night's events still fresh in our minds. In the weeks that followed, strange things started happening. We would hear whispers in empty rooms, see shadows out of the corner of our eyes, and feel a chilling presence when we were alone. It seemed that whatever had been in the asylum had indeed followed us home. Our little ghost hunting adventure had turned into a living nightmare, one that none of us could escape. To this day, the memories of that night haunt me, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. When my older kids were younger, they used to get scared going to bed. Night after night, they would beg me to come into their room and sleep with them. Their pleas always carried a hint of desperation that tugged at my heart, so I often found myself nestled between their small, warm bodies, trying to soothe their fears away. One particularly cold and moonless night, I lay between them, their rhythmic breathing gradually lulling me to sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, a movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light, but then I saw it clearly. A shadow figure gliding silently by the foot of the bed. My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced to my side to see the kids still sound asleep, oblivious to the unsettling presence. Convinced it was my son out of bed, I called out softly, "Jacob, is that you?" The figure paused, its form dark and indistinct, before continuing its silent journey toward the closet. As it reached the closet door, it seemed to dissolve into the darkness, vanishing completely. I blinked, trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed. My mind raced, yet my body remained frozen in place. When morning came, I told my husband about the shadow figure. He listened patiently, but dismissed it with a kind smile, saying I must have been dreaming. His reassurance did little to quell the unease that had settled in my bones. Days turned into weeks, and though I never saw the shadow figure again, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The children continued to beg for my presence at night, their fears undiminished. One afternoon, while chatting with a neighbor, I casually mentioned this strange experience. The neighbor's face grew serious. "You know, the previous owner's wife died in your house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She fell down the stairs late one night. It was never disclosed to you, was it?" I shook my head, my stomach churning with dread. The pieces began to fall into place. Was it her presence I had felt that night? The thought of an unsettled spirit lurking in our home made my skin crawl. That night I lay awake in my own bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was eerily silent, every creak and groan amplified in the darkness. I couldn't help but think of the woman who had died here, her life cut short, her presence perhaps lingering, seeking something, someone. The next few nights were uneventful, but my nerves were on edge. Then, one night, the kids' terrified screams jolted me awake. I rushed to their room, heart pounding. They were huddled together, eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, we saw her," Jacob cried. "Do you know the shadow lady? She was standing at the foot of the bed." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Gathering them into my arms, I tried to soothe them, but their terror was unmistakable, feeding my own. I decided then and there that we couldn't stay in this house. Whatever was haunting us, I couldn't let it torment my children any longer. We moved out within the month. The new house was bright and airy, free of the oppressive darkness that had pervaded our old home. The kids slept soundly, and the shadow figure became a distant memory. But sometimes late at night, I still think about that shadowy presence. I wonder if she found peace, or if she still wanders those dark halls, forever seeking the family she lost, forever haunting the home that was hers. The thought sends a shiver down my spine, and I pull my children closer, grateful for the safety and light of our new home. When I was about 8 years old, something happened one night that I will never forget. It was one of those nights when the house was silent, and every creak and groan seemed amplified by the darkness. I remember lying in bed, wrapped tightly in my sheets, trying to fall asleep. Suddenly, I heard the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I pulled the sheets over my head, too scared to look. I lay there, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard footsteps. Someone was in my room, walking towards my closet. I stayed under the covers, paralyzed with fear. The footsteps stopped near the closet, and the room was silent again. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to peek out from under the sheets. The room was empty. The closet door was slightly ajar, but no one was there. Terrified, I jumped out of bed and ran to my mom's room. I shook her awake, my voice trembling as I told her that someone had walked into my closet but disappeared. She listened, her face serious, then told me to go back to bed and leave the lights on. She didn't dismiss my fears or tell me it was just a bad dream, which somehow made me feel both reassured and more frightened. As I walked back to my room, I noticed something strange. The trap door leading to our crawl space was left open. We rarely used it, and it was always kept shut. My heart raced as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in my room might have come from there. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, huddled under my covers and staring at the closet. I didn't sleep a wink, and the memory of that night has stayed with me ever since. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, but it marked the beginning of my fear of the dark and the unknown. When my wife and I first moved into our old apartment, we had no idea about its unsettling history. It was a charming, albeit slightly worn, unit in a historic building. We thought the quirks were endearing, adding character to our new home. The landlord had casually mentioned something about the area's history, but it wasn't until later that we learned the building, and much of the surrounding area, was situated on a massive burial ground. I remember the night it all started like it was yesterday. My wife was asleep beside me, and our beagle was curled up at the foot of the bed. I was wide awake, engrossed in a novel, trying to ignore the occasional creaks and groans that old buildings make. The bedroom door was open, allowing a sliver of light from the hallway to spill into the room. Without warning, I felt an inexplicable urge to look up from my book. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure moved swiftly from left to right, just outside our bedroom door. It was too vague to determine any details like gender or facial features, but I could distinctly see the outline of a hat or some sort of head covering. My first thought was that it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I blinked hard and looked again, but the shadow was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine, a coldness that seemed to seep into my very bones. I glanced at my wife and our dog, both still sound asleep, completely unaware of the terror that had just passed by. For a moment, I considered waking my wife, but I didn't want to alarm her over what might have been nothing more than a hallucination brought on by fatigue. Instead, I lay there, straining to hear any sounds that might explain what I had seen. The apartment was silent, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The next morning, I brushed off the incident as my imagination running wild. However, a few days later, our neighbor mentioned in passing how she sometimes felt an odd presence in the building, particularly around our apartment. She laughed it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching the history of the area. That's when I discovered the unsettling truth about the burial grounds. The land our apartment stood on had once been a place of rest for countless souls, and it seemed some of them had never left. As the weeks went by, the shadow figure became a regular, albeit unwelcome visitor. It never lingered long, always just a fleeting glimpse out of the corner of my eye. But each time it appeared, the sense of dread and unease grew stronger. We eventually moved out of that apartment, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone. Even now, in our new home, I sometimes wake in the dead of night, expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. It's a memory that haunts me, a constant reminder that some places are never truly at peace. I became half aware that I was dreaming, although I was still in that nether region between sleeping and waking. My eyes slowly opened to slits, and I could see the glow of the faint electric candlelight through the partially open bedroom door. I lay in the bed for a moment, then tried to rise, but I found myself unable to move at all. I tried drawing in a breath and found myself unable to breathe. I could not even blink. I tried making a sound, but my larynx was shut. I was completely paralyzed. I felt no fear or discomfort, but there was no sense of peace either. I lay there waiting and watching with eyes that could barely move in my sockets. I was a prisoner in my own body. I had read about sleep paralysis, but I never thought I would actually experience it. Then a shadow suddenly blotted out the small light from the hallway, and the bedroom door slowly swung open. I feverishly thought it was the cat at first, perhaps feeling lonely and wanting to curl up at my feet. But whatever was opening the door was much larger than Pui. The room seemed to be enveloped in a living blackness, and it slowly descended on my unmoving body. A grim anticipation gripped me as the door fully opened, and a dark figure silently glided into the bedroom. It was a tall, slender woman with long, jet-black hair and a narrow face of ivory flesh. Her eyes were coal-black, completely without any white sclera. Her hands were as white as her face, nearly skeletal, and she was dressed in a long, black, featureless gown. The woman slowly strode to the foot of my bed and silently stood there staring at me with those black eyes, her face expressionless, yet somehow mournful. I lay in the bed staring back. I don't know how long the woman in black and I engaged in that static interaction. There was absolutely no sense of time. Space itself actually felt like it was frozen in that long moment that seemed to dilate to almost infinity. The darkness in the room felt like a living thing, conscious and terrifyingly indifferent. Then, without a word, the woman turned, slowly walked out of the bedroom, and the door slowly swung shut behind her. I lunged forward, gasping. My lungs were burning, and I spent a moment heaving long breaths in and out. I quickly slid out of the bed and flung the door open. There was no one in the hallway. I ran down the steps and turned the dining room lights on, then raced into the kitchen, frantically looking around. There was no one else in the house with me. Pui, who was sleeping on her small bed in the corner of the kitchen, looked up at me, startled, and hissed. I opened the mudroom door and looked outside, but there was nothing. I sighed heavily and went back inside to get a glass of water, nearly gagging as I forced it down my esophagus. I stared out the window above the kitchen sink, and my reflection stared back at me, ghostly like the woman's face. I looked at the microwave clock and it read 3:15 a.m. Jesus wept. When I was in college, I rented a room in this old creaky house with a few friends. The place had character, to put it mildly. High ceilings, wooden floors that groaned with every step, and a history that seemed to whisper in the walls. It was cheap, and we were broke students, so it seemed like a great deal. Until the nights got weird. One night I woke up with a start. You know that feeling when you just snap awake for no reason? Yeah, it was one of those. My room was dark, the kind of dark that feels heavy and suffocating. The only light came from a thin sliver of moonlight sneaking through the gap in the curtains. I felt it before I saw it, a presence like a cold spot in the room. Slowly, I turned my head towards the foot of my bed. And there it was. A figure, tall and imposing, just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back. The figure was about 6'3", towering over me even from a distance. Its face was a sickly shade of gray, like it was pulled from an old black and white movie. But the eyes were what got me. They seemed almost human, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, sadness, maybe a mix of both. Fear should have paralyzed me, but oddly it didn't. Instead, I was transfixed, caught in a silent exchange with this ghostly figure. We just stared at each other, and time seemed to stretch and warp around us. Earlier that week, my roommate Sam had shared some local lore over a few beers. The house, according to him, had been a hideout for early gangsters. A few of them had died in a shootout right here in the living room. At the time, we'd laughed it off, making jokes about Al Capone's ghost haunting the place. But now, with this specter in front of me, it didn't seem so funny. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in that eerie gaze. It could have been minutes or hours. But eventually, the figure began to fade, slowly dissolving into the darkness until it was just me and the oppressive silence of the night. I finally found the courage to move, reaching for the lamp beside my bed and flooding the room with light. Of course, there was nothing there. The next morning, I told my roommates about it. Sam nodded knowingly, while the others just looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Told you," Sam said. "This place has history." We laughed it off again, but I could see the unease in their eyes. None of us slept well after that. We'd hear footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking open and shut on their own. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd feel that cold spot again, like a ghost brushing past me. We moved out at the end of the semester. It was a relief to leave that house behind, though I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of it stayed with me. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what that spirit wanted, why it chose to reveal itself to me. And though I try to rationalize it, deep down, I know some things just can't be explained. When I was 6, a strange and eerie event forever altered my perception of the world. It happened shortly after the death of my Uncle Larry. He had been a cheerful man, always bringing laughter to our family gatherings. His sudden passing left a void that none of us could quite fill. To honor his memory, we decided to celebrate his birthday with a family picnic in our backyard, as we had done many times before. It was a bright, sunny day, the kind Uncle Larry would have loved. My cousins and I were running around, playing tag, while the adults set up the picnic table with various dishes. Laughter filled the air, but there was an underlying sadness as we remembered why we were gathered. As the day went on, my mom excused herself to go inside the house to fetch more drinks. She was gone longer than expected, and I noticed the concerned look on her face when she finally returned. She whispered something to my dad, who immediately went inside, leaving the rest of us in a confused silence. Moments later, he emerged, his face pale. I overheard my mom speaking to my aunts, her voice trembling. "It's written on all the mirrors," she said. "Don't get rid of Misty." My heart pounded in my chest. Misty was Uncle Larry's dog, a sweet golden retriever who had been with him for years. Since Uncle Larry's death, Misty had been staying with my grandma, who had been contemplating giving her away. She felt she couldn't take care of a dog in her old age. The adults quickly ushered us kids back outside, but curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to see what had terrified my parents so much. I snuck inside the house, creeping up the stairs to the bathroom. There, scrawled across the mirror in what looked like blood, were the words, "Don't get rid of Misty." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could this be? The only person inside the house had been my mom, and she would never do something like this. The adults speculated that maybe Uncle Larry was trying to communicate with us from beyond, urging us to keep his beloved Misty. Later that night, after the picnic had ended and everyone had gone home, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The image of the bloody message on the mirror haunted me. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. The next morning, my parents decided to take Misty back to our house. They felt it was the right thing to do, given the strange message. Misty seemed happy to be with us, but there was a lingering tension in the air. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of soft whimpering. I crept out of bed and followed the noise to the living room, where I found Misty staring at the mirror. My heart raced as I saw the words "thank you" written on the glass, this time in a faint ghostly script. From that night on, the strange occurrences stopped. Misty became a cherished member of our family, and we never saw any more messages. But the memory of that day stayed with me, a reminder of the unexplained and the bond between a man and his dog that transcended even death. Years later, as an adult, I often found myself pondering that bizarre event. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but none ever surfaced. Perhaps it was a manifestation of our collective grief, or maybe it was something beyond our understanding. One thing was certain: Uncle Larry loved Misty deeply, and in some inexplicable way, he had ensured that she would be taken care of. That haunting message on the mirror served as a bridge between the living and the dead, a testament to the enduring love and connection that even death couldn't sever. To this day, whenever I look at Misty, now an old and gentle dog, I am reminded of Uncle Larry and the mysterious way he communicated with us. It's a story I rarely share, for fear of sounding crazy, but it's one that has shaped my belief in the unknown and the powerful bond of love. Thanks for watching. This is Past the Pumpkin's Glow. Tune in next week for more stories.